Would you like an open debate around the pandemic and the procedures and legislation around it? Some people would. Some people are very concerned about it. Let's discuss the pandemic and how it's being handled around the world, the regulation, the legislation. Is there enough open conversation? Are you concerned about it, or are we living under a kind of necessary regulation required to deal with an emergency? Let's have a little chat about it now. Over 100 doctors and health professionals have signed an open letter to the Prime Minister calling for an open and proper scientific debate about the pandemic policy, arguing COVID restrictions are based on flawed assumptions. With something as novel as this pandemic, as unique and as recent, it's likely that there is room for change. Anything as profound as this, anything as impactful as this, is going to have various ancillaries and projections and tangents that need constant examination, constant conversation, constant adjustment. Do you remember at the beginning, masks, no masks, various distances? This is something where we need to be adaptable, where we need to be open. To fundamentally alter society in radical ways without meaningful conversation, I think is a dangerous idea, and so do the people that wrote this letter. 133 doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, paramedics and midwives signed the letter released today, which states that despite a complete lack of widespread approval among health professionals of the pandemic policies, no attempt has been made to measure the harms of lockdown policies. That's one of the things I think about. Whilst it is of course necessary to protect vulnerable people from the impact of coronavirus, to me it seems that it's important too to look at the impact on mental health, on various other diseases that can no longer be addressed or treated in the way that they perhaps should. I'm talking about things like cancer, diabetes, heart conditions, all of these things that have been put on hold in order to prioritise this rather unique situation at the moment. And again, to bring the focus back, I wonder what the impact is around mental health, suicide, addiction. These are areas in which I have more personal experience. Obviously not suicide, not personal experience, clearly. But this is, I know from the kind of communities that I move in, has been an area that has been strongly impacted. And it seems to me important to have a holistic, total view of the pandemic and its implications everywhere. In the same way as I've heard other pundits, notably Joe Rogan, say that part of the messaging should be, hey, you've got to stay fit, you've got to eat well, you've got to get regular sunlight, access to all sorts of vitamins, work on your breathing systems. These are messages that are not promoted that would surely be of benefit, even if you entirely follow the mainstream media line around this condition or this disease, this pathogen, and the implications, indication and consequences of a widespread pandemic. There's nothing wrong with promoting health measures. That doesn't mean you're yielding to what would be termed conspiracy theories. The letter also addressed the Health Secretary and First Ministers for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and said, "You have failed to engage in dialogue and show no signs of doing so. You have removed from people fundamental rights and altered the fabric of society with little debate in Parliament." Last week we did a video, I'll link to it at the end, where it talked about the amount of legislation and regulation that's being brought about by this pandemic in a whole host of countries, and the likelihood that these legislative measures will never be repealed or altered. To do that without conversation, for me, is a dangerous precedent to set, and historically, as the video that I'll link to at the end, has not worked out well for us. The signatories from a broad range of specialties came forward despite the risk of doing so both to their jobs and reputations. Founding signatory Dr. Ros Jones, a retired paediatric consultant, said, "We wrote the letter as a group of healthcare professionals connected only by our deep concern and shared commitment first to do no harm." We all know that oath. "We can no longer stand by in silence. We're not the first group of medically and scientifically qualified professionals to write in such terms to the government. In March, eminent scientists publicly called for drastic policy change. We sincerely hope we'll be the last to feel the need to write such a letter." If there's nothing to worry about, there's no harm in having conversation. If you're certain that the course of action that is being taken is the correct one, then have an open, honest, sincere debate. No, there are these complications, but we'll line it out this way. You're right, a possible consequence of lockdown is problems around mental health, but we'll take these measures in order to address it. There's nothing to be afraid of. Truth oughtn't be a fearful thing if you're being honest in your communication. Dr. Alan Mordew, another founding signatory, said, "To move forward now, our governments urgently need to facilitate a wider and open debate within the medical and scientific community for the short term as we lift restrictions and the longer term to improve how we manage winter respiratory viruses and pandemics in the future." It seems that once these measures have been implemented, that we will see a repeat of them. I wonder what we can learn. I wonder what countermeasures we can take. I wonder how we can be responsible for the various concerns and problems that come out of our our new novel situation. Caring for vulnerable people, protecting sick people, ensuring that we don't create more problems around mental health, that we don't neglect other health issues. These ideas are complex. Do you think we have the right people in the right positions to solve these problems with the right incentives, the right government, the right corporations, the right pharmaceutical industries, the right media, the right level of conversation? If you feel confident in all those areas, we've got nothing to worry about. If you don't feel confident, then perhaps you can help to advance the idea that these conversations should be allowed to happen. I'm not expressing an opinion on whether or not certain medication should be taken or prescribed. That's an individual choice for all of us to think about with our own sets of priorities and our own requirements, being responsible in whatever way you consider responsibility to be expressed. But the exclusion, preclusion, prevention of conversation is never a positive thing. It's a dangerous thing. Concerns voiced in the letter include accusations that no minister responsible for policy has engaged in open and full discussion of alternative ways of managing the pandemic, despite being aware of other medical and scientific viewpoints. It adds the pandemic response policies have caused significant, permanent and unnecessary harm to the UK and must never be repeated. The letter focuses on 10 areas where the UK's approach to COVID failed. It argues the nature of the COVID threat has been exaggerated. It claims the use of behavioural science to generate fear was inappropriate and unethical, and it argues the role of asymptomatic spread has been overplayed and used to promote public compliance with restrictions. That's a very interesting opinion. I don't have access to the data to respond to whether or not the asymptomatic threat has been overplayed. It feels to me that certainly this situation has been mobilised to meet a certain agenda. And I suppose because of my studies, let's call them that, in other areas of political and commercial history, I have concerns that there may be agenda other than the well-being of ordinary people and the prioritisation of our health and dealing with the health crisis, because I suppose I've seen what happened around the opioid crisis. I've seen what has happened around terror crises. I'm not advocating for any kind of conspiracy theory. All I'm saying is that when conversation is shut down and censorship is deployed, that doesn't make me feel comfortable. And as loads of you will be saying, when you cut out a man's tongue, it doesn't show that he's lying. It just means that you're afraid of what he's going to say. I'm fudging that real bad, aren't I? But it's the George R. Martin thing. Put it in the comments below. Finally, it states that restrictions have been imposed with an over-reliance on modelling data while ignoring real-world data. Well, that's a consistent problem. All of us know that we live in models of reality rather than a fundamental reality because of the nature of language and the way that exchange takes place. None of us have access to essence other than our personal experience of our own consciousness. If we live in fabricated realities that are designed to meet the agenda of the interests of certain sets of individuals and institutions, it's likely that the biases will drag us so far off course from what is best for all of us that before long we'll be living in an entirely fabricated reality, beneficial to a few people, not beneficial to the collective, not beneficial to most of us as individuals, no matter how varying our individual opinions might be. The signatories called for a sea change within the government, which must now pay proper attention to those esteemed experts outside its inner circle who are sounding these alarms. For example, check out this. Lockdown has major impact on mental health. Lockdown has had a major impact on UK's mental health, including increased rates of suicidal thoughts, according to new research. The study, led by the University of Glasgow, examined the effects of COVID-19 during the heights of the pandemic. Certain groups are said to be particularly at risk, including young people and women. It's impossible to ignore the likelihood that such radical social changes would not have a negative impact in other areas. And I suppose what's required in order to continually measure and adjust is open conversation. It's difficult to feel confident in the incentives and the agenda of the institutions that set the policies, the restriction, the legislation, when conversation is continually closed down. What do you want? Do you want to be able to talk openly about the possible upsides and downsides of legislation, medical responses to this condition? Or are you happy with the way that the governments of the world are rolling out these measures and prohibiting what I would call moderate, open conversation and debate? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Give this video a like if you liked it. Have a listen to my podcast over on Luminary. I do 2 a week over there. And if you need to meditate now or focus on your own personal well-being, which I think is necessary at this time, have a look at my side channel, Awakening. And the video I told you about earlier in this one, have a look at that here. It goes into serious depth. Remember to sign up onto my mailing list at russellbrand.com so I can communicate directly with you. But most of all, stay free. And remember, you know what has to be done if we are to be free.